The title of my talk is Kundalini and the Mayan calendar. And I do have some experiences of Kundalini energy from the Oneness University in India, where all the spiritual practices are designed to raise Kundalini energy and as a tool towards unity consciousness or enlightenment, as is usually called. But this particular presentation, it will be focusing mostly on the big picture. How does consciousness evolve over time? And the most important tool to understand that, I would say, is the Mayan calendar, which actually is a description of not only the rhythm of biological evolution, but also the rhythm of mental evolution. And you might say that the evolution of consciousness is really like a consequence of these different processes. And to start with a description of the Mayan calendar system, I think a very appropriate thing is to look at one of their most famous pyramids, the one in Chichen Itza. And what you see here is the so-called pyramid of the plumed serpent. And as you can see, it is built in 9 different levels. And what you can also see is that at the particular time that I took this photograph, which was on the spring equinox, there is a special kind of a light show that is being produced on the side of the staircase. So you can see that on the side to the left of that staircase, you can see how there are like 7 triangles of lights that goes down into the serpent head at the bottom. And what this means is that, what this symbolizes, I should say, there are waves, alternating pulses of light and darkness. 7 pulses of light you can see on this particular picture. And each of these 9 levels of evolution that the pyramid describes is developed through one of these wave movements. And that's what the plumed serpent, as this deity was called in ancient times, it symbolizes a wave of evolution. And as Michael Bradford talked about earlier in his excellent presentation, the evolution has a goal. And in terms of Mayan calendrics, the evolution is to climb to the top of this level. So in other words, you come to a place where you're in resonance with the highest wave of these 9 waves. And that's a possibility that has arisen to us quite recently. Only 5 years ago, the highest frequency wave in the Mayan calendar system was activated. And this is something that gives a new possibility for all kinds of spiritual evolution, but especially for the kind of Kundalini awakening that lead to a shifted perception of reality, which is what I would call unity consciousness, and with a little bit more exclusive word maybe used as enlightenment. So I'll continue a little bit with the next slide to deepen this discussion of the calendar system, because this is not just a sort of a calendar that is symbolic or in vague terms describes what is happening in the world. It's a very, very precise calendar system. It precisely describes at the current time the evolution of the mind, And what you can see there to the left is the 9 different levels, the 9 different waves that the pyramid on the previous slide showed. And then each of these waves has a frequency of their own. And as you can see there, there is the duration of the waves. They are the durations are shortening so that the frequencies are increasing. And with every higher wave, there is a 20-fold increasing frequency of the waves. And then finally on this slide, to the very right, you have the dates of activation of these 9 different waves. And as we will see later, they bring different aspects to human evolution into existence. But the waves are sequentially activated. And the very first wave, it goes back, as you can see, 16 billion years. And what is important about that is that that's a good estimate of the age of the universe. So this is these waves that the Mayan calendar system describes go back, they cover the entire evolution of the universe from its very inception at what today is called the Big Bang in physics. And then there's been on top sort of a new layer. With every wave, a new layer of evolution have been added to that. And they have been sequentially added, as you can see there at the column to the very right. So please, if I can see the next slide. So then the lower 4 waves on this pyramid, they are the waves that are developing biological evolution, the large-scale geometries of our bodies, you might say. But then the higher waves, they each carry a particular polarity of the mind. And you can see, at the bottom level there, it's a wave that started 100,000 years ago, and that's sort of when humans start to be endowed with a spirituality, with a shamanic mind or something of that order. And on top of that comes a dualist mind, a mind of duality that started about 5,000 years ago, or in 3001 BC. And that's really the wave of civilization. And then you might say that that's when people start to build pyramids and so forth. And people start to create an outer reality that is considered by the activations of these different waves. So then you can see a lit person or no light person starting in 1755. That wave is the Industrial Revolution. Top of that comes the Digital Revolution, and on top of that is the Unity Revolution, and that's just barely beginning, I should say. But it's sort of, as you can see, it's sort of going from unity through separation, and then by the activation of the 9th wave, the highest, the possibility of looking at the world, perceiving the world through unity becomes a new possibility, and also then to express that perception of the world in our actions and in the kind of world that we are creating. So please, next slide. And this mind, the human mind, it's not created by our brains. Our brains, rather, I should say, are downloading a global mind, which ultimately is like a galactic and cosmic mind. And what you can see here on this slide is, again, you see the 5 highest levels of the mind, each created by one of these waves in the Mayan calendar system. And but what you also can see there to the left is that these polarities of the mind, they are actually reflections or resonances with the polarities of the planet. And so one thing I want to place your attention to is in the leftmost column, North Pole at the top there. If you look at how the polarities of the Earth is shifting in this, according to with these different waves, you find that it goes through a spiralic moment, a spiral movement, and again it goes through unity, through separation, and then finally up to unity. So please, the next slide. And so what you see here is that these different polarities of the mind that has been created by the higher waves of the calendar system, it leads people to perceive reality differently. And again, here what we see is how these perceptions of reality brought about by these polarities of the mind, how they result in different ways of relating to the ultimate reality, to the divine, based on different filters that people have in different time periods. And you might say that originally then people were in some kind of a shamanistic state of unity. If we go back to the age of the cave painters in Europe and so forth, much indicates that people very strongly identified with animals and so forth in those eras. But then comes the duality of the sixth wave. And during that whole era, people create religions. And as you might expect, those religions would very often have the ideas about separating the good and the bad, or the good and the evil, so forth. We know it very well from the Abrahamic religions that there is a crucial aspect of ethics there, that you're good or evil. And this is not very surprising if you look at the kind of polarity of the mind that people carried in that era. It was dualistic. People saw reality through this kind of a dualistic filter, and as they projected that, they came to see the world in sort of black and white, and that was very much a part of the kind of religions that were created. And then on top of that, we know around 250 years ago, the first outspoken atheists started to emerge, and much of this later era have been dominated by much more materialist ways of thinking based on the polarity, or actually absence of polarity, that the seventh wave carries. And then more recently, we've had the New Age, the neo-shamanism, which it's different from the ninth wave, where in the sense that the eighth wave relationship to the divine was often sort of ignoring that there was a divine. It was mostly focused on what shall I say? Much more symbolic symbols or manifestations of the divine than the actual divine. So anyway, here you see how through the climb of the pyramid that the Maya would build, there has been a stepwise possibilities of going from unity to separation and then back to unity. And that's, as I said, is a possibility in its full collective sense to manifest that is very, very recent. So now this is not just, as I said, general concepts. This is really something that can be verified through the system, for the study of history. So if I can have the next slide, please. So I'll just to make some connections between the Mayan system and Indian philosophy and so forth. It's interesting to study, you know, how did this sixth wave, the one that created civilizations, begin? And what is interesting here, I take this, these are, the picture to the right is a symbol of how the world was divided in 8 different segments at the time of the beginning of the sixth wave, or what the Maya also would call the long count. And this is what's in the ancient inscriptions from the Maya, that the world became separated into different energies. And that had a fundamental consequence for human beings, because we are all in resonance with the earth. And it's, if a new grid is being established, a new grid of straight lines and perpendicular lines is being established on our planet, it means that we human beings who are in resonance with the Earth's grid, we will start to download a mind that has incorporated into itself straight and perpendicular lines. And then, you know, we should not be particularly surprised that at that time people start for the first time then to build pyramids, which are really just manifestations of straight and perpendicular lines in an amazing accuracy. And so this is how the Maya described this sixth wave, the 5,000 years of civilization that I believe some of the earlier speakers would also be discussing. And it really meant the downloading of a mind that, on the one hand, had the ability to create very advanced technologies like the pyramid buildings and so forth. But it also was a mind of separation. And that has a lot to do with how at the time, you know, people may not have become so enlightened. Rather, people would be creating these religions that we've known of, that creates very often in its mental structure, creates separations. So please, next slide. I just want to point out that, you know, the beginning of the Kali Yuga, at least as it was described in ancient times, happened pretty much exactly at the same time as the Mayan Sixth Wave. And it's also described then in the Indian tradition as a time when separation was introduced, and Krishna would leave the earth, and instead the earth came to be dominated by the demon Kali, who brought quarrel and disconcert and so forth into human life. And so it's basically saying the same thing, but in a little bit different religious context, that at this time separation emerged. But what the Maya then are doing is that they explain why this separation emerged, because these the earth became separated in 8 different energies that people were in resonance with, and then people started to create project separation onto the world outside of them. Next slide, please. And this is just to show how around that particular time, according to modern estimates, and I just collected a number of datings based on Wikipedia to make it easy, and we can find that pretty much all the phenomena that we associate with the rise of human civilization, they emerged. The first manifestations of those, they emerged pretty much exactly at the time when this sixth wave started. So it was a technological advancement. The mind came into existence, you might say, for the first time. People didn't have minds before this. But then, as a result of that, not only did you get all these aspects of civilization, but you also got a separating relationships, social relationships, as a result of this, the activation of this wave. And next slide, please. And so from that point and onwards, you can follow. You see the beginning there. This is a time period about 5,125 years. And you can see from the time of the activation of this wave, civilizations have risen and fallen. And overall, when there is a time period that is a day or a peak in the wave movement, the mind will be activated. The global mind will be activated. As a consequence, the people that have individual minds that are in resonance with the global mind, they will develop skills, mental capabilities. But then, in between these times, the days when civilization moves forward, there will also be dark ages. And some of these time periods have been very destructive, and where some has not been so destructive, but usually it's not those valleys in this wave movement that have been moving civilization forward. So you might say through these steps of 7 peaks, and you may now recall the picture I showed initially of the plumed serpent on the pyramid of Chichen Itza. There are 7 triangles of light on that particular image. Through this, civilization have moved from sort of stepwise from the early beginnings of civilizations in Egypt, Sumer, and Indus Valley. It's gone to the current global civilization based on especially the British and later the American empires that have created such a thing. So next slide. I won't go into any kind of detail about this. It's just to show that this wave movement very precisely shows, for instance, the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. And that's something you can verify by simply studying history and see how it corresponds to the Mayan calendar. And next slide, please. What you see here then is the last of these waves, and what is noticeable then is, as you can see here, is that on the level of the sixth wave, we are actually now going into a dark age, and you see it in many different ways in world politics, and you see it how I would say there's a lot of misuse of the digital revolution that has happened recently. People start to trust news sources that are sometimes completely fake, and there's a tremendous amount of conspiracy theory out there, and there is a sort of somewhat of a breakdown on the intelligence of the mind that is typical of the days in this particular wave. So it's just a reality. This is part of the reality that we're living through today. Next slide, please. But you know, it's, as I mentioned earlier, there are 9 different waves in operation, and and the only inscription that we have from ancient times, from the Maya, is that at what happened at the shift in the Mayan calendar that happened in 2011, and not 2012. It doesn't really matter, but it was a misrepresentation that you heard a lot about, December 21, 2012. But what really happened then, according to the ancient inscription, was that the totality of the 9 waves would then, you know, was looked upon as a deity, would then manifest in its full regalia. And what that means is that the potentialities of each of all of these 9 waves are now active and can be accessed by human beings. And that's a completely new situation. It's never been like that in the entire history of evolution of the universe. But for the first time, the collective can, in principle, also access the highest wave, which is the 9th wave. Next slide, please. And you know, this is to show these are each of these waves. They have different frequencies, and especially if you look at the picture to the right, you can see now that the 9th wave is active and accessible, and what this means is that if we go back to the next page, yeah, is that now all of these are available, and it's a new situation, and to a large extent it depends on the choices people make, of how conscious they are of how evolution actually proceeds, and how these waves of evolution are driving all aspects of it. We can choose to sort of create resonance with different polarities of the mind. And some people are still, you might say, in the 6th wave, meaning that they're still very much into this separating mind that distinguishes people and creates conflicts, and as you know, the Kali Yuga was described. But then there are other, depending on our own, where we are in our own evolution and many other factors, we now actually have the possibility of resonating with the 2 highest waves there, which is the 8th and the 9th wave. And I don't want to say that I, you know, know what Kundalini is and how this is related to the overall evolution of the mind, as I have described it here. But I do want to point out, you know, come back to this sort of spiral evolution that is a result of this climb on a collective scale of human consciousness, that you know, maybe this spiralic movement is really what is being reproduced on an individual level in people that have the experiences of Kundalini rising. So if that proposal is true, it means that we can start to see and start to understand why it is that this Kundalini rising experience is something that is now increasing. And it certainly has been ever since Kundalini yoga has been introduced in the West. The reason it's increasing is that it's only now, as of March 9th, 2011, according to the Mayan calendar system, that the possibility is there to fully sort of reconnect with this unity consciousness that is the intended goal of evolution. Next slide, please. So I want you to ponder that. Ask if it's a question. So in terms of actions to contribute to the global shifting consciousness, I have 3 suggestions. One is to start to follow the 9th wave, which is the wave of unity consciousness. And there I have a link to it. The reason is that, you know, to follow this wave makes you sense first of all, it may convince you of the fact that there is an evolutionary wave that is now active and is leading to unity consciousness or enlightenment, and in a way that, you know, an expression of Kundalini rising. To follow that, but also to learn to see how you are related to this particular wave. And that can hardly be done just by general descriptions like this, but it's actually done by following this particular wave. And, you know, it's a related suggestion, which is, you know, to set the intention. You know, everything starts with intention, and that's the first thing, and to manifesting unity consciousness. And what I found myself to be very useful is the spiritual practices that have been coming from Oneness University, and some of these are free and available in many US cities, like the Diksha and Sacred Chambers, and I think they are tools for this thing. So the final slide, please. So I just wanted to advertise a little bit myself and tell you, you know, if you want to know more, my website is calleman.com, and I have 2 books coming out this year that are very much related to this particular topic: The Global Mind and the Rise of Civilization, and The 9 Waves of Creation, that provides a coherent description of how the evolutionary goal is really this rising of Kundalini, and also the attainment of the state of unity consciousness. And over time, despite that, the difficulties that the world is facing because the 6th wave have gone into a dark age, over time, it is the higher waves that will predominate. And it is the higher waves that will increase the amounts of spontaneous Kundalini rising. And over time, when these waves have been accessible for a longer period of time, it will attract more people and time, and unity consciousness will be the form of looking at the world, perceiving the world, and recreating the world that is leading to a golden age. So thank you very much for this.